Father Daniel Renaud, thank you for being with us for this discussion on resilience, effects of confinement during this COVID-19 pandemic, and finding hope and transformation in this situation for religious communities. You were one of our panelists for September and October webinars that were offered to our religious leaders across Canada. You are a priest, religious itinerant preacher with the Oblates of Mary Immaculate of the U.S. province, although you're originally from the province of Quebec. And you are now in San Antonio, Texas at the Oblate School of Theology. You have quite a varied background with degrees in drama education, theology, pastoral ministry, psychodrama, and you are a certified spiritual director as well, which has led you to preach retreats to religious communities, to be a spiritual director as well. And so in these webinars that we did in September and October, we looked at grieving and transformation, trauma and resilience, and how people and religious communities could mobilize their energy and their faith towards coming out of this pandemic with some measure of transformation and hope. So I'd like to address these themes with you once more for the purpose of this interview.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's great to be here. I want to begin by saying that it was a great learning experience for me. And what I mean by that is to be able to reflect on that very important topic, but also to get input from people. When we did the webinars, I found that getting into the nitty gritty of the reality of what religious communities were going through, although we are going through similar things here. We just learned recently that our retirement home, one of the nurses had tested positive for COVID, and we don't know what's going to happen and if any of the oblates or the other employees have been infected.
Well, certainly we can say that 2020 and probably a good part of the year 2021 will be remembered as a time of global challenges because of this COVID-19 pandemic, and religious communities have not been spared deaths, impact on their missions, and the call to transform and adapt. The pandemic has required this of everyone in some way or another. But let's start by talking about grieving and mourning. Almost everyone, religious or not, eventually knows someone who has dealt with COVID, perhaps died from it, or perhaps we know someone who's had someone close to them die during the pandemic. People have been faced with the death of a family member or a sister or brother in their community. But their grief has also been prolonged because of the circumstances and waiting to be able to hold a funeral, sometimes months after the death took place. So we know that this happened in religious communities, and perhaps this was even more painful for some communities because they are used to really living a communal life. What can you tell us, psychologically speaking, about grief in general, and then about some of the additional challenges of grieving in the context of a pandemic?
Well, to me, grief is an integral part of experiencing our life, and also our human and our spiritual development is interwoven into grief. Unfortunately, we are, and there have been pioneers in that field. I'm thinking of my confrère, Jean-Maud Bourquette, who is considered to be a world specialist on grief. The reality is that we still are in denial about death, and as a culture, and that grief continues to be an issue for us and a challenge because we see it as some form of sickness, strangely enough, as if grief wasn't normal. So the thing about grief is that it's really something that we all have to face. Now, the thing with grief during the time of COVID, and especially during lockdown, when periods of time where the rituals and a lot of the consoling adaptive measures we have and that we use are not able to be mobilized. We have to find new ones. And what happens is grief can be either paused or completely stopped. So that what's going to happen is you and I are talking about something that probably will be experienced more in 6 or 8 months. We hope that post-vaccine, normal situations of how we can deal with grief will be back. But what's more difficult now is to deal with grief where the measures that we normally have in place, getting together, eating together, singing together, being able to hold ourselves in the container of a liturgy or a ritual of some form has been suspended. So we have to find new ways.
So we haven't had access to the rituals or the things that help us cope, usually when dealing with grief. Would you say that for some people, especially with the consequences of lockdown, of being isolated in their own rooms and not being able to live the community life, do you think that this has caused a measure of trauma for some people?
Yes. We need to remember that grief is not a trauma in itself. I always say this to people, that normal grief is not a trauma. Actually, a trauma is when the process of grief is interrupted or stopped or paused for some reason. And I think that the chances of developing some form of mild, medium, or strong forms of trauma are possible at this time for a variety of reasons. The first one would be that people might be predisposed to developing a trauma. And so that in lockdown situation, if they've felt any form of mental or emotional or physical challenge that was already difficult to deal with, this might be spurred on and come back, especially when you have a lot of time where you're not doing anything. Your inner life is more available to you. So it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're more aware of how, quote unquote, suffering and pain or hurt you are. On the other, you've got more time to address it.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to talk about another level of grief that some people may have dealt with. Not everyone had the experience of losing a family member or a loved one, or even in religious communities, some communities were simply not impacted by COVID or by a cluster, thank goodness, while others were. But in some way, everyone around the world, when this lockdown started in March 2020, there was a great awareness that seemed to hit people with the onset of the pandemic. This awareness, we said it was, we need to stop, we need to reset. We're living in a life of madness. We're over-consuming and exploiting our planet's resources, and this pandemic is a way for our planet to say stop. And there was this great sense that we needed to create a new normal, but that also means that we have to grieve another way of life, and that for some religious communities, it could also mean grieving the way that they would live their apostolic mission. And so there was this sense of a call to transformation. But how would you encourage people or communities to discern this call to transformation?
Well, I would say that the first thing is to name the reality for what it is. What is happening with the different individuals? What are they experiencing as a community? How can you take the pulse of what is going on? Are there people that are hurting more than others? That's certainly to really take into account what is happening in the relationships, and to see it as a kairos moment. I know that sometimes it sounds a little glib to say that the most extreme experiences are also possibilities for growth. And I don't want to be undermining how painful that can be for people. But the call to transformation there really is about a different way of experiencing life and community life, and also to reassess the priorities that have been established. Many religious communities are already experiencing a transition. And so this is kind of precipitating a transformation, you might say, that we might not be ready for, but that it's accelerating something that was already in the making. So it's new and it's not new. It's normal and it's not normal, in that the possibility that COVID basically kind of acted as an accelerator or an amplification of what was already there. Were the resources stretched thin? Was there a need to reevaluate where are you going to put more energy and less energy? How do you address the issue of taking time with each other in community when you don't have the means that you normally did? One thing I've noticed is how people have become very adept at technology. And some people were not using technology at all before. And I think that that's a good thing. Now, of course, nothing replaces in-person contact, especially when people are hurting. You want to be able to hold hands and touch and feel the other person, have a physical presence. But when you don't, I think some communities are realizing that there are ways of doing things now that can be experienced differently. So some of it can be a transformation as simple as, are we operating differently? But also at a deeper level, what priority do we put in people's inner life? And how much investment are we willing to put in people to live and to experience and to, strangely enough, to use this word, to thrive when they're being diminished and they're experiencing diminishment and loss of all kinds of faculties and are close to dying? Do we need to reassess how we address this so that we take more care of the most vulnerable ones in our communities, in our society, and in our religious communities?
And you make a very important point, especially as at the time that we're recording this, most countries have been hit with a second wave. And even though the first lockdown there was an experience of novelty and adapting and a sense of hope that we would get through this together. But the second wave is also coupled with a sense of deep fatigue, maybe even anger towards this pandemic, and it is maybe affecting us more on a mental health level. And so we've been talking, I think we've been hearing the word resilience a lot more. So I want to ask you, how do we build that resilience, and what is resilience?
Well, resilience is a motivational force that we all have, and it's actually a force that's present in all human beings and in all non-humans. We've seen nature rebuild itself, especially when we were using and misusing our resources a lot less. There was some idea that the sky was getting a little clearer. Some animals were coming back in areas where we had not seen them. Now, it might have been temporary, but it's certainly saying something that nature is resilient, non-humans are resilient, and human beings are resilient. And resilience is something that comes from within, and it's not something you will. It's a spiritual motivational force that helps us to live adversity or challenge and to be able to bounce back from it. Now, the best way that I can describe it is with an image, and the image that comes to mind is the fable by the French writer La Fontaine, the oak and the reed, where there's a big wind and the oak says he's strong, and then there's this huge storm, and the oak is completely uprooted, and the reed just bends and comes back up. Now, some of us have been bent quite a bit, and we might even still feel like we're in that transition of feeling like the wind is still blowing. But the ability to bounce back is certainly what resilience is, but it's not an outward thing. It's not something we create. It's not something we produce. It's not something we can will. I can't will that I'm going to be more resilient. I can participate in the motivational force that's already present within me, the way I do with participating with God's grace. I don't create God's grace. God's grace is within, and I participate, and we participate in the grace.
There was a biblical verse that we meditated in our September webinars with the religious leaders that we can find in the book of the Apocalypse, Revelation and in the prophet Isaiah. And I'll paraphrase it quickly, but it's, "Behold, I am making all things new." And that's God talking and telling us to open our eyes and see the newness that is emerging. Um, what is How does faith play a role in resilience, and what's our relationship to God in that dynamic of building resilience?
I think that's a foundational question that COVID is, and all difficult, violent, painful challenges and or experiences put us in front of. Where is God in this? How do we speak about God when things like this happen? One thing I've always been fascinated with people that look from the outside on people that have experienced trauma. They'll say, "Oh, that person is going to grow from it and they'll get better from it." Well, we're not sure about that yet. There needs to be a pause there. The other tendency that we have is to spiritualize the experience too often and not see that. So basically, what I'm saying is we don't want to use God too quickly. It's important that we look at the reality for what it is, and whatever wounds are happening. And when we do that, then we can not put a Band-Aid on it, but certainly expose the wounds and name the wounds. And it's painful to do that. But no newness comes out without looking at the old and noticing what you're letting go. You can say yes to something only when you say no to something. No to how people who are vulnerable are being treated in society. No to elder care abuse. No to, you see, we need to move to and so I think the two tendencies that we have is to put God in everything, or and I have a tendency, well, God is going to fix all of this. We just need to pull through and brace ourselves. And I think that's kind of like not doing justice to our grace builds on nature. Our nature is to notice these wounds. I'm thinking of the passage, for instance, where Jesus is with Thomas and he's appearing to them. Thomas hasn't had the chance, and he says, well, if he's going to appear, I want to touch his wounds. And when he wants to touch them, Jesus says, don't put just your finger, put your entire hand in there. It's almost like God is saying, before you make or you speak about me when you're encountering difficulties, so that you don't go into denial, look at what the wounds really are. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is to know that the capacity is there because it's built into Christianity itself. Jesus is a resilient person. Christians are resilient. The entire writings of the Bible, especially the New Testament, they were written by people who were finding resilience as they were telling the stories of pulling through these immense traumas of persecution and the trauma of the cross itself. So we don't want to get too quick to spiritualize. And then once we are able to do that, I think we can participate and enter into the grace more fully and more completely.
And I'm also hearing that you're calling us as a church or as a religious community or as a believer to not make our resilience about our own self, but to be sure that it is part of a collective resilience and an awareness of the wounds in our larger human community.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because most people, and I think we all suffer from that. It's like, you think of Nelson Mandela. We have a tendency to say that he was incredibly resilient because of what he went through. But what we don't appreciate, same thing with Martin Luther King and other figures, what we don't appreciate is these people were supported by entire communities. I mean, apartheid was vanquished because there were interreligious energy, motivation, and determination behind this. The people we put in front often become individuals, and we have a tendency in our society to over-evaluate resiliency in individuals and not to see it as a communal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that we need to remember. We're never resilient alone. We're always resilient as a community and as a family or as a group. And the reason for that being that resilience is only and often experienced only when an other human being is involved to help us. And it only needs to be one, but it's better if there are more than one. And when that happens, it can change everything.
And actually, looking back at our Christian tradition, we have centuries of models or inspirations, people who can model that resilience for us, whether they could be saints or they could be contemporary figures that are known or mystics. So as a bonus question, who would you suggest we look to inspire ourselves in this resilience that is both personal and collective?
Again, I would say that before we go to the roots of our spiritual wisdom, we should also look at the cultural one. I've just been reading recently a novel Ru, R-U, by Kim Thuy, who is a refugee from Vietnam. And you know, as I read this, I notice the power and the luminousness of her writing and the resilience that is there throughout is very striking from her early age when she was 10 years old, when she arrived in Quebec and lived in eastern townships. So we have to look at people around us, people in our own communities first. Then you are right in saying that there's a plethora of figures that we can be inspired from. Two of them that I'm more inclined to look at, and that's because they've been part of my own experience spiritually, and also because I wanted to go to people that had experienced pandemics themselves and or a form of extreme violence and or threat. So I'm thinking of Julian of Norwich, an anchoress, and we know that she experienced in England 3 different waves of the plague. She lived in a time of protracted civil and political wars, religious wars, and her resilience is just uncanny. But what even is more comes to the fore when you read her today is her capacity to speak about God and as a mother, as a gentle figure, as one who uses sin and used in the sense of the best term that sin is kind of like a springboard, strangely enough, for grace to overflow. And there were people that were saying, well, it's because people are living immorally that we're being plagued by this plague. And she said, no, God is not punishing us. That's not the message here. The message is that God continues to love us through this, that this was not sent by God to punish us in any form. And so she speaks rightly about God. And at the same time, she finds a lot of strength and resilience in God to live some very adversarial experiences. The other figure, and this one is a figure that's more contemporary. She's a kind of like a mixed bag in terms of her spiritual background, Christian, Jewish, also very heavily influenced by Carl Jung, another psychologist, Etty Ilsum, the Jewish, and I call her a mystic. Well, she died in concentration camps at an early age, and she lived during the time of Nazi hatred, extermination of the Jews. She came from a well-off Dutch family herself. And as she's writing and processing what is going on, you see a very bright light in a very dark age. And there's something about that to me really speaks to how we can be inspired by figures who have a lot to say about how we can approach this and what we can say about God. Something that's really unusual about her, and you might say that theologically, some people might be uncomfortable with it, but I find the mystical stretch in it really stimulating. She says, God actually needs me. God needs us so that we can be there for one another and be the light and be the hope that somehow other people around us cannot find. Now, she's not saying that you create this out of nothing and that you will it. She says that you receive it. And it's really interesting. She was a Jewish woman, and she had this impetus to kneel down and to put her hands in her face and to pray in silence, and many times a day. And she would do it for hours. So maybe this kind of contemplative surrender in complete silence. She said that it's in there that she found the light. We have a tendency to want to grab something from out there that's going to make me resilient. I think that the mystery is that it's always within, and in order to do that, we need to go within. And when we do that, it's painful. But going through the pain means that we can see the other side. You know, in recovery, in AA and in other recovery movements, they say that people find resilience because they finally are moving through the pain instead of trying to numb it. And I think that if we numb the pain, we're going to have some problems. But if we look at the mystics, the saints, the people around us that had the ability to sustain it, to live it, and to move through the pain, I think these people are amazing examples and witnesses of resilience. We need to remember that as Christians, we belong to a community of resilient people. And that's something that we need to continue to deepen as a true mystery in how we experience this lockdown.
Father Daniel Renaud, thank you so much. You have shed light on this situation. You've given us some great insights, and let us hope that there aren't too many more months of troubled times ahead. But if there are, you've given us some great keys to look inside us and find God calling us to building that resilience with our brothers and sisters. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate doing this for you. Thanks.